We now welcome Paulo Drinot from the Institute for the Americas.
Okay, well, I want to talk about this image, which is also on the cover of my book, The Allure of Labour, Workers' Race and the Making of the Peruvian State, which was published in 2011. As you can see, the image depicts a worker wearing overalls with his hand outstretched, pointing to a background in which there's a factory, and also around the picture we see oil derricks and so forth, all kind of representations of industry. And he is standing next to a seated figure. The seated figure is clearly identifiable as an Indian. He's wearing a poncho, also a chuyo, which is the Andean woolen hat. And we can just about make out that he is holding in his hand some coca leaves. So the image is the cover of this journal, Peruvian Industry, published by the National Industrial Society, a sort of lobby group for Peru's industrialists, and which was set up in the early 20th century and is in fact still in existence today. And the image captures very well the main argument of my book, which is that in early 20th century Peru, indigeneity and labour were incommensurable categories. Indians could not be workers and workers could not be Indians. This was important in a country and at a time in which the vast majority of the population was indigenous, but also in which industry was widely believed to be the agent of Peru's modernization. The suggestion was that Indians qua Indians could play no role in Peru's modernization. They would only be able to play that role once they became workers, and in order to become workers, they had to cease to be Indian. In other words, the modernization of Peru was contingent upon the overcoming its indigenous character. It required the evacuation of the Indian from the national project. Now, the incommensurability between indigeneity and labour, and more particularly industrial labour, was expressed in a number of ways in the early 20th century. In addition to many publications by intellectuals, lawyers, and so forth, we find the 1920 Constitution, which included separate sections which dealt in turn with the Indian, for example, establishing Indian communities as legal entities, and with workers, establishing social rights, the right to establish unions, and so on. Similarly, during the 1920s and 30s, a series of institutions or state agencies were established which dealt either with Indians or with workers. The Ministry of Development, for example, established a Labour Affairs section and an Indian Affairs section. The Labour Affairs section dealt with industrial disputes, while the Indian Affairs section dealt with conflicts over indigenous land and so forth. Of course, Indians, that is to say individuals who self-identified as Indian or would have been categorized as Indian by others, occasionally took disputes to the Labour Affairs section. But they did so not as Indians, but rather as workers. Indigeneity and labour were incommensurable spheres of state legibility, as James Scott would put it, and indeed of state action. When the Peruvian state introduced the Worker Social Security Law in 1936, the law was designed in a way that implicitly excluded Peru's indigenous populations from its coverage. The intellectual architect of the law, Edgardo Rebagliati, stated, and I quote, "When the indigenous population enters industrial life, it will be incorporated into the Social Security Law, but it is and must remain excluded as long as the Indian does not qualify as a worker." End of quote. In other words, Social Security would extend to Indians when Indians became workers, i.e. when they ceased to be Indian. So my focus on the incommensurability between indigeneity and labour is a contribution to a much broader question on how Peru, and more specifically Peru's modernizing elites, constructed and went about addressing the so-called Indian problem. Others have looked at the Indian problem in the context of education policy or public health policy, and particularly in the context of the rise of indigenismo, that is to say, in the context of a series of scholarly and cultural artistic interventions about the Indian, but produced mostly by non-Indians. And most of these studies have focused on the ways in which indigenismo was a failed attempt to incorporate the Indian into the nation by either revalorizing the Indian and his place in the nation, particularly in painting, photography, theatre, and so forth, and redeeming the Indian through the inculcation of civilized values and habits. The Indian, according to these indigenistas, had been great in the past, but the experience of Spanish colonialism and Republican neglect had led to his biological and cultural degeneration. Redemption was possible. The Indian could be made great again, but the greatness of the Indian would result invariably from cleansing the Indian of his indigeneity. Indigenista educators would teach the indigeneity out of the Indian. Indigenista physicians would heal the Indian of his indigeneity. The goal of the indigenistas was to celebrate the Indian while at the same time de-Indianizing him. So as the image suggests, Peru indigenista industrialists understood industrialization primarily as an embodied project of racial improvement. Like the propaganda posters of European fascist and Soviet regimes, the image expresses the identification of national progress with the creation of a new man. In the case of Peru, elites identified national progress with the creation of a new homo faber, expressive of a racialized understanding of industrialization as progress. The image of the Indian and of the worker as representing the past/present and the future articulates the elite's belief in the transformative power of industrialization, but clearly locates the transformation not in the sphere of the economy, but in the sphere of race and culture. The power, perhaps the magic of industry, the image suggests, resides in its capacity to transform Peru's indigenous peoples into civilized, white, mestizo industrial workers. The image thus makes a claim for the nature and conditions of citizenship. It is non-indigenous and therefore white mestizo. The Peruvian nation would only constitute itself once industrialization had transformed Indians into workers. Put differently, the emergence of the industrial nation would bring about the elimination of the Indian. Naturally, the idea about the incommensurable nature of indigeneity and progress was and is a racist fiction, but it has proved powerful in Peru. Throughout the 20th century, the national projects of successive civilian and military regimes all reproduced this idea. Progress was contingent on de-Indianizing Peru. So most students of Peruvian history and politics see the historical marginalization of the Indian as a lack or a failure of the nation state. But I think they are wrong. The historical marginalization of the Indian is the Peruvian nation state's necessary and a constitutive condition. And what I call the allure of labor in my book expresses the impossibility of imagining the indigenous as subjects and agents of Peruvian history. Thank you.